Well, tonight on Behind the Wall, we're going to delve into the fractured relationship between Australia and China and flesh out what it might take to repair what remains a critical economic relationship for this country. Joining us from Sydney is Stan Grant, the ABC's International Affairs analyst; from Canberra, Yun Jiang, the Director of China Policy Centre and the editor of the China Story at the Australian National University; and Yet Sen Li, the President of the Chinese Australian Forum. Lovely to have you all with us tonight. Stan, let's start with you. The relationship has been vital to Australia's economic success for such a prolonged period. But for China, this is no longer a transactional relationship. What's changed?
Well, I think China is much more assertive. Some would say even aggressive, Bev. It is certainly a much more powerful country. This is a country that is right now the biggest engine of economic growth in the world. It's surpassed the United States in those stakes. It is on track to become the biggest economy in the world within the next 10 years. It sees this region, the region that we are in, the Asia region, as its sphere of influence. It wants to be the preponderant power in the region. It is a great power and it demands to be treated as a great power. Now, of course, we've seen this in the past. The United States is a great power. It demands to be treated in such a way. It's founded on what they see as American exceptionalism, that it writes the rules of a global order that suits America's interests, and China is in a position where it wants to assert its interests as well. What's critical here, though, Bev, is that it rejects a lot of the fundamental principles of liberal democracy as we understand them. And that's where we're seeing this tension in the criticism of China's record at home, its values, and where that rubs up against our values. And we're seeing all of that playing out right now.
So Yun, let me bring you in here now. How does Australia adjust to that ideological shift that China has made and that it sees as its rightful place in the region and globally?
Well, certainly China has become more assertive and some would say more aggressive internationally. And how Australia responds? Well, Australia engages with China in its national interest and pushes back against China when the circumstances demand it. So, for example, Australia would still like a very good economic relationship with China. But on the other hand, Australia, being a liberal democracy who values human rights, also speaks out against human rights abuses in China. So in that sense, Australia engages with China in its national interest. As the Prime Minister says, Australia does not seek to to contain China, because I think containing China is probably not going to be a successful strategy. So Australia, as a middle power, what we need to do and what we have been doing is to work with other countries, other like-minded countries, to push our agenda and our interest.
So then, Jason, if Stan is right that there has been this complete shift and Australia has to accept China's position, how do we re-evaluate how we deal with a nation that is going to be so dominant but yet doesn't share our values and our democracy?
It's a very interesting challenge for Australia, and I think that one of the ways we could do it is having a razor sharp focus on our own national interests and understanding what those are. So where China's values are different from our own, and when there's unacceptable behaviour, interference, coercion, etc., we need to push back against that really, really hard and not to give way there. However, that is not to say that we can frame China as an enemy or purely as a threat, or as something that is evil. We have to recognise that there are many sides to China, and there are some sides to China which are good. China can provide international public goods. It can do good in the world, for instance, in climate change, in scientific research, in providing aid to developing nations. And so I think that we should double down on those areas where we can cooperate productively with China, but where we don't agree, we need to stand firm.
I'd like to ask a question about our economic leverage. And Stan, we see coal exports today, the latest industry that's going to be hit. What financial levers can we pull, if any, or would that be a mistake?
Well, if you look at our recent budget forecasts, Bev, we are relying on China to grow post-COVID at around 8% to help drag Australia out of the recession that, of course, we've had to induce as a response to dealing with coronavirus. It is our biggest trading partner, and that limits our leverage here. I mean, one of the real criticisms, I think, in recent times is that we weren't looking at offsetting some of that dependence before it got to this critical point. So to the extent many of our eggs are in the one basket. You mentioned coal there. Well, China has other alternatives. Let's remember, China provides most of its own coal. So it's getting its supplementary coal from foreign sources. But it can go to the likes of Mongolia for that. It's increased its infrastructure, its road networks to be able to transport coal within China more effectively to other parts of the country. It's building more coal-fired power stations right now, even as it's also aiming at transitioning to other forms of energy. So coal's an example of where they can exact that sort of price. Now, iron ore, of course, is critical to China as well, and it's very much relied on Australia to supply that, and that may create some opportunities for Australia as well to be able to leverage. But I think, just going back to Jason's point, it's really critical here that we do find areas that we can cooperate in to be able to bring down the temperature. That is absolutely critical. Climate change, and this is one of the areas we may see the United States and China under a Biden administration start to work more effectively. If the Biden administration goes back into the Paris Climate Accords, as it is expected to do, China says it will be carbon neutral by 2060. That gives some room there for two big powers to work constructively together on a critical issue, and that can lead to an improvement in relations. So we need to focus on that. But let's remember this as well. It is difficult when you get into moral equivalency and start to compromise or trade away what are our fundamental values. And you cannot turn a blind eye, can you, to 1 million Uyghurs being held in detention, to the ongoing crackdown against democracy protests in Hong Kong, or more critically even, any attempts by China under Xi Jinping to take back Taiwan. They would be red lines that we simply can't walk away from. That's when it gets very difficult.
Yeah, so at what cost? And Yun, come back in here, because I guess what we need to try and understand is what will China give ground on? How do we come back into this relationship while still, as Stan says, standing up for what we believe in and not turning a blind eye? What can we see China moving on?
I think in a bilateral relationship, we both need to come to the table. And right now, China has been a bit unwilling to do so. We know that now they sent a 14 grievances, list of grievances they have with Australia to the Australian press, which shows that they wanted the narrative turned around to be that Australia is the one to blame. But really, Australia has been trying to engage with China, but China has not been returning Australian ministers' calls. So what can we do to improve this relationship? Well, one thing is, Stan is completely right. We cannot trade away our values. But we don't have to trade away our values. There are ways we can frame things. There are ways we can use diplomatic tools so that when we communicate our concerns, it's in a way that is more palatable to the Chinese side. So, for example, we can band together with other like-minded countries so that the effect is not as sharp and not focused at Australia. So there are a few things we can do. We can learn from other countries in the region and see how Southeast Asian countries or Japan and Korea has managed their relationship with China, for example. So even though we don't want to trade away our values, there's still scope we can do to improve our relationship.
Jason, let's talk for a moment about the many thousands of Chinese diaspora. How difficult is it for them to be straddling both sides, remaining loyal to the motherland, so to speak, but embracing Australian life?
I think Chinese Australians have been really crunched at this time. It's been a very, very difficult year. And that's encompassed the coronavirus, of course, and this sort of Trump rhetoric that it was the China virus and it started in China and China has brought this on the world. And I think we've all sort of seen reports about the rise in anti-Asian and anti-Chinese racism that the Chinese community in Australia has copped. Then there's just the underlying sort of anti-China sentiment. And the sort of weaponized, hyperbolic sort of narrative around the rise of China and China's increasing assertiveness, and sort of Chinese Australians are stuck on that. But going back to something that Stan said about standing up for our values, I think this is just so important. There's been a real rise in distrust against Chinese Aussies. So you might be an Australian citizen, but if you have Chinese heritage, all of a sudden people are going, well, are you really on Australia's side? If we tell you something sensitive, are you going to, spill your guts to the Chinese side on this one? And can I just say it's so important that we trust our citizens, because the moment we start not trusting our citizens, distrusting our citizens, that is so fundamentally against our Australian values that we could end up destroying them ourselves.
Mm. And Yun, you were right in the centre of that. How damaging did that feel to you when you were forced to publicly state your loyalty to China or Australia?
I was very shocked when that happened. It did make me feel as if I was not a full citizen in this country. But again, afterwards, I did receive a lot of support from my colleagues and from people that I haven't even met before. So that really underscored that, this behaviour is not acceptable to the majority of Australians, and it is against the Australian value.
Mm. Stan, of course, we've seen a US election. We know now that it's going to be a President Biden. How much comfort can Australia take from that, thinking that, OK, old world orders are going to be restored and that might protect us from a very aggressive China?
That may be the problem. The old world order is the problem because China identifies that old world order as working against China's interests or not respecting China's place in the world as a great power. Now, just in the past week, we've heard from Prime Minister Scott Morrison and our top diplomat, Francis Adamson, head of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and both indicating that that old order is changing and that we don't live in a world where we can just impose our values on others. Some have talked about a post-American world, Bev. I don't believe we are there yet. America is still absolutely essential to a global order, but it is not hegemonic to the extent that it was for much of the post-World War II period. So we are adjusting now, or readjusting, to a return of great power politics. And that really does complicate the situation. It makes things very difficult for us, and I think you add to that an ideological element to this, and we probably underestimate this in the West. Post-Cold War, we thought big ideology was over. Ideology is alive in China. What the Communist Party stands for, socialism with Chinese characteristics, or authoritarian capitalism, to use a colloquialism, is something that they believe is fundamentally a more robust and better model, at least for them, than liberal democracy. This does have an ideological element. We need to focus on that. We need to be aware that there is an ideological element. And when it comes to the United States, there is, in fact, bipartisanship between Republicans and Democrats. Not a lot of difference between Donald Trump and Joe Biden when it comes to China. It sees China specifically as a competitor. Remember, Joe Biden described Xi Jinping during the presidential debates as a thug. What they do have is different ways of going about it. Whereas Trump was more confrontational and unpredictable, Biden is going to look at building alliances. But make no mistake, China is in the crosshairs. They see China as one of the real threats, in fact, the biggest threat to US security, and that makes things difficult for us.
And Yun, do you think we've got double standards? We're happy to give up stuff to fall in line with the United States because they share our values. We do what they do. We join military conflicts if they want us to, but we don't want to necessarily give up sovereignty to a country like China, even though we are so dependent on them.
Well, when we join the United States in some of its ventures overseas, obviously the government of the day believed that it was in Australia's national interest. And of course, the United States military alliance with Australia is very important and continues to be very important. So those are the things the government do need to take into consideration. But just going back to what Sen said, that there is an ideological struggle that we don't share values perhaps as with China or share history with China as much as we do with the United States. One thing that we do have to keep in mind that when we counter ideological threats from China, that we do hold fast onto our liberal values and we do not give up our civil liberties just to confront China.
Yeah, but Jason, we're seeing in Hong Kong, we're seeing, as Stan pointed out, if it is something that China considers close to its internal matters, we aren't allowed to venture there. How do we tread this path, and do we look at regional alliances as a way around it to protect ourselves going forward?
It's always better to hang out in packs rather than sort of go it alone. I think some of the things that we've done could have been done better. For instance, if the inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus were instead an inquiry into the origins and then the management of the coronavirus, that might have allowed China to save some face in the way that it managed it after the fact. So there's little nuances in this and how we go about things that I think can make a lot of difference. But to the ideological side of things, I think that again we need to be very clear about what we stand for and what our values are. But at the same time, find areas where we can cooperate. So China is a strategic competitor to Western values, but it's not an enemy. And strategic competitors can have mutually beneficial, strong, trusting relationships. It happens in business all the time. So it's critically important that we frame China as a strategic competitor with whom we can cooperate, perhaps on answering a bunch of the big global issues that confront all of us, such as climate change, such as resource scarcity, such as global pandemics. But we can't see China as an enemy.
And Stan, I just want to wrap up now this really fabulous conversation around whether you have seen any signs from Scott Morrison that he might be understanding that there needs to be a shift.
Yeah, look, Australia has been a little bit slow in responding to this. Our policy has drifted in recent years. I think Tony Abbott once summed it up. He said our policy when it comes to China is informed by a mix of fear and greed. Certainly our interests and we've grown wealthy off the back of China's rise, and we've also contributed to China growing wealthy, as the Prime Minister has pointed out. But there is an element of fear, and I think we've seen that in recent times, and where we have tried to stand up, we've seen China push back against that. I think the speech this week from Prime Minister Scott Morrison was interesting because he did say that we are not America's deputy sheriff in the region. We are not making decisions based on a binary choice between the United States and China, and that's clearly what we have to endeavour to achieve. The difficulty here, Bev, is that China also has a voice in this. And when we say we don't seek to contain China, that may not be how China in fact sees it. So Jason talks about, and I think he's right in this, finding the nuance, finding the language, treating China like a great power and consulting with them before you make major announcements that may indicate a shift in direction or a shift in the relationship. These are the things we now have to consider. It doesn't mean kowtowing, it doesn't mean giving up on your values, but it does mean being aware that there is a shift in the balance of power, and we do live in this world, and I think we've seen indications of that, particularly over the past week, and that's really the line we have to walk in what is an era of great power rivalry.
A really important conversation. Thanks for helping us start that tonight. Stan Grant, Yun Jiang and Jason Yet Sen Li, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Pleasure.
Pleasure.
Beverley.